myself. My name is Lindsey O'Neill. I'm calling in from Palmetto, Florida right now. I'm a correspondent for Today News Africa. I'm familiar that you are a Central and Southern Africa expert. Could you tell me a little bit about your background?
Sure. Most of my career has been in government. I worked for many years in the United States Senate as a staff member, and at one point was the staff director for the Senate Subcommittee on African Affairs. I was the senior director for Africa at the National Security Council for President Obama, and I was a U.S. ambassador to Botswana and U.S. representative to the Southern African Development Region.
I would like your thoughts on the current situation in Tigray. What is the most current development news that you are familiar with? And can you give us a little bit of background of the region and the issues that they're generally facing? And then we can go into the specifics of the crisis we're currently dealing with at this moment.
Tigray, of course, is one region in Ethiopia that accounts for about 6% of the country's population. Ethiopia, for many years, was governed by a coalition of political parties, and the dominant element in the coalition was the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So the Tigrayans and the TPLF had kind of outsized access to power in Ethiopia for a couple decades. And most recently, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed ascended to his leadership position, it marked a significant change in kind of the relative power of the members of the ruling coalition. He is not a TPLF figure, and his reform agenda for the country, which the international community was largely very excited about, it included releasing political prisoners, opening political space early in his tenure. That agenda also sort of implicitly included this idea of rebalancing power. And as his government started to kind of curtail the TPLF's access to levers of political, military, and economic power that they'd enjoyed for quite some time, tensions rose. And that kind of drove toward the conflict that broke out in November. Now, all of this takes place, just to pan back for a minute, against a backdrop of a very strategically important part of the African continent, the Horn of Africa, and with Ethiopia as the kind of dominant political and security actor in that region for quite some time. So as goes Ethiopia in many ways, so goes the region. Ethiopia has been an exporter of security in the sense that it provides peacekeeping troops in Somalia and in South Sudan. It's been kind of the center of a lot of the diplomatic activity in the region for some time. So that in November, the conflict came to a head. The kind of precipitating event was a TPLF attack on federal forces, but it was very clear based on the movements of troops, et cetera, that the conflict was coming. And you essentially had the government of Ethiopia using the military instruments of the state against a part of the state in Tigray, despite announcements from the Ethiopian government that this was a law and order operation that was quickly concluded. That it's very clear that some fighting persists in the region. It's now a murky and messy situation involving not just federal troops and the TPLF, but also troops from Eritrea. This was denied for months by the Ethiopians until just in the last 24 hours when Prime Minister Abiy has at least acknowledged that Eritrean troops crossed the border into the region, but there's a great deal of reporting and evidence to suggest that the Eritreans moved pretty deeply into Tigray, and that they have been responsible for some of the worst abuses. You also have kind of militia forces from other parts of Ethiopia, most notably from Amhara, who are in the mix and have also been implicated. There is none of these four sort of armed elements have not been implicated in abuses of civilians. There are pretty well documented reports of atrocities. There has been, deliberate targeting of healthcare centers, so things that would be recognized as war crimes. And so you have a situation of grave insecurity, serious human rights abuses, humanitarian crisis, as civilians in the area have been displaced, don't have access in many cases to healthcare or to food. There's concern about impending famine. Over 60,000 people have crossed the border into Sudan as refugees. But a great deal more are internally displaced. And, kind of the way forward is unclear, in the sense that, for a long time, the international community and the government of Ethiopia weren't really talking about the same set of facts, even in describing the situation.
That's really interesting, because I've in my research, I've seen that there has been a lot of seems to be a disconnect between what is perceived by the public and also what's happening on the ground. So I'm curious if you could go a little bit deeper into what U.S. and international aid has been processing, what they've already tried to put on the ground, and what's actually accessible to the people, locals, Ethiopian locals. I've heard that, and please correct me, but I've read that Eritrean troops have been destroying or vandalizing some of the aid that has been there, such as like medical pop-ups and so forth. If you could just go in and discuss how, if the aid is provided by the international community, if it's enough, and what should be changed so that it's accessible, if it is or isn't accessible.
Okay, so humanitarian access has been a major sticking point, and probably kind of the major first order of business on the international community's agenda in trying to respond to this crisis. And really the issue has been one of access. So from WFP, the World Food Program, to MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, very adept organizations who operate in remote and complex security environments have struggled to be able to get on the ground. This has been in part due to the overall security situation, and in part due to bureaucratic obstacles that have been erected by the government of Ethiopia. Now, over time, with much kind of tussling and to and fro, access has gotten better. It's still not what the humanitarian community would like for it to be, but it has improved to be able to, move people, supplies out on the, to the areas where civilians have been displaced and need help. But there's sort of more to be done. So, I personally am not in a position to verify individual reports, right, about who has been targeting humanitarian aid. But this is kind of part of the problem, is that given the difficulties in accessing the area, it's very hard to get a kind of complete picture of what's going on. And there are human rights groups, right, who've been using well-developed methodologies, interviewing civilians and trying to get a clear picture of what's happened. So I do feel confident in saying that the evidence of atrocities committed in the area is very clear. And you even have Ethiopia's own Human Rights Commission coming out to acknowledge that, which, you know, is a testament to the integrity of that institution and sort of those early days of hope about changes and reforms in the Ethiopian state. But it's, you know, I couldn't tell you about what you may have read about regarding a specific situation of Eritrean troops targeting aid. I don't have enough information to say one way or the other if that specific thing happened.
If you could just go into detail about the Eritrean troops, if there's a cause as to why the violence and the hostility has been so extreme. Has there been a sort of ethnic hostility that was there prior to their entrance as a military group? And also, what would it take for those troops to be removed short term and also more long term if they choose to stay independently?
Okay, well, so the backdrop to that in many ways is that Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a brutal and costly conflict at the end of the 1990s, from about the middle of 1998 until 2000. And so this was during the time when the TPLF was the most powerful element in Ethiopia. So there is longstanding animus between the Eritrean government of Isaias Afwerki and the TPLF. When Prime Minister Abiy came to power in Ethiopia, he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for kind of formalizing the peace with Eritrea. And now the war had been over, obviously, for some time, but there'd been kind of a, you know, chilly relations without the normal kind of exchange of they did not have normal relations, Ethiopia and Eritrea, for many, many years. And then this was kind of addressed by Prime Minister Abiy and Isaias. And, you know, this was widely perceived as a positive thing, right? Sort of finally closing this chapter on hostilities and tensions between these neighboring states. But with this conflict in Tigray, what we see is what appears to be kind of score settling on the part of the Eritreans, right? A sense that they had unfinished business with the TPLF, and that is, you know, widely used to account for the brutality that's been attributed to Eritrean troops on the ground. Now, it matters a great deal whether or not the Eritreans were invited by the government of Ethiopia or not. And that remains tremendously unclear. If the Eritreans are in Ethiopian territory, not at the invitation of the Ethiopian government, you know, that's obviously, it's an invasion of a neighbor. It's a fundamental kind of crossing of basic international norms and rules, and is something that the international community would have a responsibility to address. If the Ethiopian government invited those troops in, then the Ethiopian government too bears responsibility for crimes that were committed by those troops. So this is a, kind of an important set of questions in terms of accountability, next steps, but the unwillingness for months now of the Ethiopian government to even acknowledge the reality on the ground has made it difficult to get clarity. And I think it's definitely a positive step that at least now we're not pretending that what everyone can plainly see in front of their eyes is not happening.
So would you say, briefly, I have a question in regards to improving the clarity of the situation, the transparency of the situation. Would you say that this is a matter of getting more reporters on the ground? Would this be a matter of having transparency between the international community, the public world, and Prime Minister Abiy, or something else?
Well, certainly it'd be great to have more coverage, better communications coming out of Tigray. And the Ethiopian government has been harassing reporters who've tried to cover it. There have been instances of reporters and people who are on journalists' teams appearing to be targeted for violence. So it's difficult to get the whole picture. So what needs to happen for the world to get more clarity? More access for humanitarians, more access for journalists, and more honesty, right, from all parties in discussing what's going on. With the Eritrean troops, this is a real, kind of point of frustration. Either they were invited or they weren't, right? This isn't. There is no actual reality of kind of murky middle there. Were they invited or not? It's not a spectrum, right? It's a yes or no. Mm-hmm. and so there needs to be, some forthright honesty about just what's going on here and who is under what authority where.
And that can really only come from the government agency that did or did not issue.
Yeah, there needs to be, the onus is certainly on the federal government of Ethiopia. Now, obviously the Eritrean government bears responsibility for honestly accounting for the actions of their military as well. I think, that is a government that's been sort of a pariah for many years, and the degree of isolation has waxed and waned. The EU just applied sanctions again to the Eritreans, but I think the world is expects less in some ways of Eritrea because of this long history of sort of flouting international norms, whereas just a year and a half ago, right, everyone was still incredibly excited about the prospect of a reform agenda in Ethiopia. The Ethiopians are also driving toward elections coming up this summer, which will be an incredibly challenging thing to pull off in a country where there are multiple pockets of insecurity, not just in Tigray, and obviously kind of questions of social trust are unresolved in the country. But there's Ethiopia operates in a space that looks to be accepted and understood by the rest of the international community, right? It doesn't wish to be understood as an authoritarian state or a dictatorship, whereas, with Eritrea, kind of that ship sailed some time ago.
And if we could zoom in from an international perspective to a regional issue, what sort of political pressure, especially with Tigray's unique location of being kind of on the border of multiple countries and influences, what would you say the future may look like if it becomes a refugee issue, which, as you said prior, there's already a movement of refugees moving out of the area. What regional political pressure or influence do you foresee happening in the near future to put some pressure on Prime Minister Abiy to take the situation more seriously or differently?
Well, regionally, there's a set of kind of complex dynamics that all relate to each other. There were already tensions in the region surrounding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that implicates access to Nile waters for Sudan and for Egypt, as well as for Ethiopia. Very serious tensions around that. You have currently a border conflict, a dispute essentially about where the border is and whose territory is whose between Sudan and Ethiopia that is not unrelated to Tigray, in the sense that the tensions and fallout from Tigray have exacerbated the situation, but is not actually about Tigray itself. So there are kind of, you also have a very complex situation in Somalia that is heavily influenced by these developments as well. So, the regional fallout is not just going to be about Tigray in any way. There's a set of difficult security questions that can tip the balance in fragile states like Sudan, where there's a transition ongoing, right, and a kind of delicate balance between military and civilian actors. When you have a set of security threats coming on the border, that tends to empower the military. So you have the kind of political trajectories of states in the region being influenced by this. You have the potential for interstate conflict. Certainly between Sudan and Ethiopia is a very serious worry, and there has been, worry about the dam conflict, which is, largely political, being made manifest physically. So it's hard to tease out just Tigray in this context, but it's certainly what it's doing is exacerbating all of these other tensions, right? Making it harder to resolve them. And at this point, has been empowering Eritrea, which is not been a positive or stabilizing actor in the region.
My final question, and please elaborate on if there was any topic that you wanted to go and elaborate on. What observations or recommendations do you have, or do you observe as the best way forward from here to mitigate the crisis in Tigray?
For the international community, so I think that the most important thing is to insist on humanitarian access, on accountability. So that means there needs to be a thorough investigation that includes some independent international actors to assess who is responsible for crimes that have been committed in the region. There needs to be a great deal of diplomatic work to de-escalate tensions on the border, right? And to try and ensure that all these various potential sparks of conflict get moved into negotiated channels and aren't able to kind of light the tinder for another armed conflict. And then, I think there needs to be international support and pressure to some degree for a more inclusive kind of reckoning in Ethiopia with what the way forward may be, or we're likely to, see more of this kind of instability. So, there are multiple facets to this crisis. It is an appropriate item for the UN Security Council's agenda. It's a clear threat to international peace and security. You do have, the military of one state having crossed the border into another, where they appear to be responsible for very serious human rights abuses. So the idea that this is just kind of an internal domestic matter, that needs to be kind of firmly rejected. And then the international community needs to move out in kind of these multiple prongs of investigation and accountability, humanitarian response, and diplomatic work to try and bring some stability and some justice to the region.
Well, thank you. I think you really brought the issue down to a level that I feel like it is, as you discussed in detail, that the situation, not only in Tigray itself, but regionally, the complex political tensions that are happening from decades of conflict. It's easier to digest, and sometimes when you see news articles, it can be a little overwhelming for people to kind of understand what's happening. So I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope that we can connect again and discuss more events and issues dealing with the African region. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. I mean, it's always great that people are paying attention, right? I think this is fundamentally a good thing. And I really, I think it's great that you're covering this, because it is incredibly complicated, but also incredibly important.